If only the Roman people had a single neck. This sentence, in its current form, seems to convey little or appears unfinished. However, if we rephrase it with the underlying intention, it transforms into something like, if only the Roman people had a single neck, so that I could sever it from the body with a single stroke. This statement belongs to Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the third emperor of Rome, who ruled between 37 and 41 AD. Ironically, despite all his titles, we remember him today by a nickname he despised throughout his life, acquired when he was just a young child, Caligula, Little Boot. He uttered these words when, during a gladiator fight, the Roman people applauded a team he did not support. Whether his wish had come true or not, whether he would have severed the neck of the Roman people from their bodies with a single stroke, we do not know. However, these words serve as a poignant reference point to understand the extent of Caligula's simmering rage. The name Caligula is synonymous with perversion, sadism, and madness for those familiar with Roman history. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing about 80 years after the emperor's death, recounts his excessive revelries, disrespectful behavior towards statesmen, incestuous relationships, murders committed for pleasure, and unrelenting cruelty. This portrait, largely crafted by Suetonius, has become even more terrifying over time, thanks in part to the contributions of popular culture, especially Hollywood. Yes, today we will talk about Caligula. Some of you surely know him. Some may even have watched the 1979 film Caligula, directed by Italian filmmaker Tinto Brass. But for those unfamiliar, let's provide a brief introduction. What did he do? Here are a few of the most well-known examples. Declaring himself a deity, turning the palace into a virtual brothel and engaging with senators' wives openly, attempting to make his horse a consul, wandering the palace corridors at night and ordering the sun to rise. During the northern expedition, collecting seashells as a symbol of victory against the sea god Neptune. These are just a few that come to mind. With such actions, his reign did not last long. Of course, in the year 41 AD, on a cold winter night as he returned to the palace, he was assassinated. Actually, what we are going to do today is not to delve into the madness of Caligula. You can find numerous studies on this topic, and we have covered his life in a different video, which you can watch by clicking on the link provided in the description if you are interested. Today, we will delve into the depths of Caligula's mind, focus on the underlying reasons for the behaviors we listed, and attempt to analyze the data we have scientifically. In short, we will uncover Caligula's psychological profile. Now that we've briefly introduced our man, let's get started. First and foremost, I want to begin by stating what every scholar researching Caligula's psychology emphasizes. It is not possible for us, from our current standpoint, to precisely diagnose Caligula's illness with the data at hand. The only thing we can do is examine the texts written about him and use modern psychological theories to speculate about the emperor's psychological state. So, where can we start? German writer Judith Herman states that repeated traumas in childhood shape an individual's personality. Therefore, let's attempt to identify Caligula's traumas based on this quote. Firstly, let's consider the environment Gus grew up in. During infancy, he was left under the supervision of his grandfather Augustus for an extended period, being separated from his parents for approximately 18 months. Some researchers like Vin Massoro and Donna Harley believe that this period of separation from his parents had a negative impact on Gus's development. Historian Suetonius claims that Caligula suffered from the morbo cadendo, what the Romans called the falling sickness, known today as epilepsy. This disease was tremendously horrifying for everyone living at that time. Being a prince or ruler meant nothing. Suddenly falling down, convulsions, frothing at the mouth. All these symptoms were associated with being cursed and abandoned. His condition must have undoubtedly affected Gus psychologically. One of the most traumatic events he experienced in childhood was witnessing the collective execution of a group of rebellious soldiers by his father Germanicus. During this time, Gaius was only 2 years old, and we have no evidence of how he perceived these events. However, his later indifference towards death probably began to manifest due to his experiences during this period. It is also worth noting that despite all this, Gaius led a fascinating life until the age of 7. He was a member of the Julius Claudius dynasty, which ruled Rome and had servants ready to fulfill his desires. His father was one of the empire's most esteemed generals and was rising in prominence each day. However, things started to take a turn for the worse around 19 AD. First, Gaius's father, Germanicus, died under suspicious circumstances. The young prince probably did not anticipate that this was only the beginning. In the following years, he witnessed the deaths of other family members, including his mother and brothers. Emperor Tiberius, who was concerned about Germanicus's rise, had a hand in many of these deaths. I mentioned earlier that Gaius remained indifferent to the deaths around him as he grew up. The deaths he nonchalantly faced were not those of ordinary people. There could be 2 reasons why Gaius reacted calmly to the deaths of his own family members. Either Gaius was trying to survive by playing a role to keep suspicions away from Emperor Tiberius, or he genuinely felt nothing in the face of these deaths. In the first case, the situation can be explained as a survival instinct. However, the second case is a bit more complex. According to modern psychology, being indifferent to negative events in one's surroundings is a symptom of schizoid personality disorder. However, it is highly unlikely that Gaius had this disorder. Individuals with this disorder tend to distance themselves from others, show sexual disinterest, and remain unresponsive to criticism. These traits do not align with Gaius's character. On the contrary, we are talking about a man who parties until the morning, is sexually insatiable, and reacts angrily to criticism. This leads us to the first option, the possibility that Gaius suppressed his emotions to survive. To strengthen this theory, we need to delve a bit more into the adolescent years of the young prince. During the period when family members were being killed one by one, Gaius initially stayed with his grandmother and later came under the supervision of his uncle, Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was not in Rome at this time. During the last years of his empire, he had withdrawn to the island of Capri in the southwest of Italy. During his time there, it is not entirely illogical that Gaius might have pretended to survive. Consider this: everyone in his family was accused of treason against Tiberius. In those years in Rome, there were 2 punishments for such a crime: exile or death. Gaius must have quickly realized that the first punishment was only symbolic among his surroundings. His mother and brothers were first sent into exile and then executed. In short, mourning for his family could mean sharing their fate for Gaius. Although the historian Suetonius does not dwell much on his indifference, he writes that Caligula took pleasure in torturing people, but had to suppress such feelings under Tiberius's supervision. However, this situation does not last very long. Tiberius dies in March of the year 37 AD. From that moment on, Gaius becomes free and suddenly one of the most powerful men in the world. He is now the new emperor of Rome. It might seem reasonable to think that such a man, gaining power all of a sudden, went mad, honestly. For example, the scenario might unfold like this: repressed emotions in our minds, a troubled childhood, years of surveillance under Tiberius. Well, it's quite reasonable to think that this man would turn into the narcissistic Caligula we're familiar with from Hollywood movies as soon as he seizes power, right? However, the reality is not like that at all. In fact, the first years of Caligula's empire, when looked at by the Roman people, seem like a short-lived golden age. Among his achievements, there is everything: tax reductions, free wheat distribution to the poor, consecutive gladiator fights, a raise in the salary of the Roman guards, a general amnesty for those accused by Tiberius. The list goes on. Well, this man has done quite good things. You might ask why I've been treating this man like crazy since this morning. Don't be in a hurry, we're just getting started. In October of the year 37 AD, Caligula fell ill with a fever. Historian Cassius Dio doesn't say anything about what this illness was. The most explicit source we have about the details of the illness is the history of Alexandrian Philo. Philo associates the emperor's illness with frequent bathing, excessive drinking, and engaging in too much sexual activity. Of course, this is an unscientific interpretation. We have no clear data on what Gaius's illness actually was. Over time, researchers have created a rather extensive list of possibilities. This list includes everything from epilepsy to lead poisoning, insomnia, and several others. However, the most popular view is that the illness Gaius experienced in 37 AD was encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. Among the symptoms of encephalitis, there may be fever, headache, pain felt in muscles or joints, fatigue, and weakness. However, in some individuals, symptoms can be more severe, including hallucinations, seizures, loss of sensation, paralysis, loss of consciousness, and even threatening symptoms such as a coma. Historians like Cassius Dio, Josephus, and Philo write that Gaius's consciousness was closed for a while during the illness. However, it is not possible to diagnose whether the illness was encephalitis with this data. The only thing we know is that after this illness, Gaius slowly began to change. Historian Philo says that this change happened quickly, but the data shows that Caligula's behavioral disorders emerged over time since the illness. His relationship with the Senate can be taken as a reference to identify this, because Caligula's peculiarities initially created a gap between him and the Senate. However, the exact date of this is in the year 39 AD, 2 years after Gaius's illness. Some research suggests that this illness did not cause any mental damage but began to gnaw at him psychologically from the moment he woke up. What does this mean? Let's try to explain it a bit more. When Gaius recovered from the illness and regained consciousness, he saw that everything had worked perfectly in his absence. Everything was fine, which actually wasn't such a bad thing. But Gaius perceived this situation differently. If the empire could be managed in his absence, then he was not needed. If he were killed one day, no one would be affected by it. It is with this thought that Gaius slowly falls into the clutches of intense paranoia. This paranoia intensifies over time, pushing him towards the limits of madness. Historian Howard Hayes describes Caligula as coming out of his illness as a lust monster and a devilish tyrant. During this period, Gaius begins to suffer from insomnia. He cannot sleep for more than 3 hours at night, fears even the slightest noise, and orders the sun to rise as he walks through the palace corridors. During the day, he becomes aggressive and irritable. As his paranoia deepens, he begins to blame those around him. The first to be affected by Gaius's suspicions are Praetorian Guard leader Macro and Tiberius's grandson Gemellus. After this, deaths and scandals become almost a part of Gaius's reign. The young emperor, with the influence of unlimited power in his hands, starts to believe that he is a god over time. He orders temples to be built for himself and sacrifices to be made in his name. These behaviors can be associated with high-level megalomania. When we delve a bit deeper into this issue, we can uncover some events underlying Gaius's behaviors. In Rome, people could be deified to be honored as gods. Even though Gaius might have realized earlier that he had the power to deify someone, with this event, he must have certainly grasped the extent of this power. If Gaius could deify someone, why not the most powerful man in Rome, himself? Gods are important for Romans. They build temples for them, sacrifice, and organize festivals. Gaius, after waking up from the illness, will use the sense of insignificance he fell into to deify himself in a way that people would still need him even after his death. Now, researchers associate this with Gaius's illness. Lead poisoning was a practice in ancient Greece and Rome, where a syrup called sapa was added to wine to enhance its taste. This substance, known as lead sugar by Roman historians, was allegedly prepared in containers supporting the synthesis of lead acetate. The intensive use of this substance leads to lead poisoning in individuals, causing various disorders such as cognitive impairment, fatigue, irritability, anxiety, vomiting. However, this was not exclusive to Caligula. Almost all aristocrats in Rome at that time were heavily consuming this substance. A group of archaeologists studying this subject discovered that the bones of Roman rich people contained much more lead than the bones of slaves. Therefore, we can generally say that some problematic behaviors observed in the emperors of the time might have been related to lead poisoning. Who knows, perhaps Gaius had a certain share of this condition in his behaviors. However, lead poisoning alone seems insufficient to explain his excesses. Recent studies focus on the possibility of Gaius suffering from mania. Symptoms such as experiencing sleep problems, an increase in sexual desire, developing unrealistic beliefs about one's abilities, an increase in provocative and inappropriate behaviors, an increase in alcohol or substance use, heightened mood, increased thinking and speech content are indicative of a manic episode. Showing at least 3 of these symptoms is sufficient to consider someone as manic. Considering Gaius's situation in light of these manic symptoms, it seems to point to a manic episode. Nevertheless, the historians of the time often label him as insane, and accusations of madness stand out as one of the easiest charges against Caligula. In fact, we have enough data to consider that his condition may be related to both mental and physical disorders. Some events he experienced in childhood might have contributed to the peculiar behaviors he exhibited in adulthood. Regardless, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not possible to precisely determine the type of behavioral disorder Caligula had, considering he lived approximately 2,000 years ago. Whether he was a madman acting in the name of the gods or an autocrat gone rogue is, I believe, something that will never be conclusively determined. The purpose of this video was not to justify Caligula's actions. Regardless of the circumstances, a serial killer is always a serial killer. Having experienced a traumatic childhood does not make him more innocent or guiltless. Of course, the same applies to Caligula.